Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation called Cargo Pedal, Harnessing the Potential of E-Cargo Bikes for Urban Sustainable Transport. My name's Blazejewski and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the research project that we've only just started at the University of Salford. For a little bit of background, I'm working on this project with my colleagues Dr. Graeme Sherriff and Dr. Nick Davis. We're based at the University of Salford in the Healthy Active Cities Research Group. Healthy Active Cities is a research group we started about 2 or 3 years ago to look at predominantly cycling and walking research in Manchester, but over the last few years that project has grown and now we have started to look at other forms of active mobility, the rise of micro-mobilities and e-scooters and things like that. And we've recently started this study into e-cargo bikes in Manchester. The project came about early in 2020 really, when we saw a funding call for a bit of a scoping study to look at urban sustainable transport methods and the decarbonisation of our cities through the lens of transport. So we put in a funding bid and to do a scoping study really, looking at e-cargo bike use across Manchester. The idea being to speak to businesses, different organisations, cyclists, non-cyclists, and sort of get a cross-section of industry to talk about the potential role of e-cargo bikes in their sector, looking at the barriers, the challenges, some of the opportunities, and to really sort of map out how the e-cargo bike landscape could begin to look in Manchester over the next few years. That's the starting point that we had. As I mentioned before, we're based at the University of Salford, which is right next door to Manchester City, and Manchester is obviously seeing a huge urban expansion at the moment. We're seeing high rises going up everywhere, new housing estates being developed and an influx of people, and that is putting pressures on our transport systems. There is also a huge amount of work going into developing new cycling lanes and cycling infrastructure around Manchester to encourage these more sustainable modes. As a result of COVID-19, we've also seen a huge amount of pop-up lanes, pop-up cycle lanes appear around the city, which was able to support the increase in walking and cycling that we saw during the height of lockdown. There's also a lot of independent businesses in Manchester that work in creative sectors, and I believe e-cargo bikes are a great opportunity for them to decarbonise their transport systems and also be a little bit more flexible in the way that they are able to navigate the city. So our research questions really started with looking at what is the potential for e-cargo bikes to reduce the impact of freight delivery in urban areas, particularly looking at how to replace fossil fuel powered vehicles. So really looking at that sort of logistical freight aspect of how do you move things around, how are they being moved around, how could they be moved around differently, and could e-cargo bikes play a role in looking at this? The second question is about the actual and perceived barriers to e-cargo bike uptake. We are anticipating a lot of these to be similar to cycling, but from the early days of the research findings, we're seeing there are actually some barriers specific to cargo bikes as well that are sort of standing quite separate to the traditional barriers to cycling. So looking at these barriers and then also thinking about how they could be removed or reduced or mitigated and what incentives could be involved in this process to help the uptake of the bikes. And finally, how can infrastructure really accommodate a significant increase in cargo bikes? You know, cargo bikes are big, they're heavy, they're moving stuff around, which is again adding to their already quite substantial weight. And so what features are required of infrastructure, whether on the road or in different organisations? This could be around sort of storage, for example. So what features are required of infrastructure to facilitate a significant increase in e-cargo bike use? So those are the three sort of main questions that we started off looking at, and this led to us developing a methodology. Now, as I mentioned, this project is a real scoping study. It's quite a short-term project. It's only 3 months long. And the idea really is to get a snapshot of what's going on with e-cargo bikes in Manchester, who's using them, who isn't, why not, what are the opportunities, the challenges. And to do this, we decided that we were going to carry out 5 interviews with e-cargo bike users in the city to understand some of that real world application of use. and then follow this up with 5 focus groups looking at different sectors of industry and discussing the potential of e-cargo bike use within those sectors. And this is the stage of the research that we're currently in at the time of this presentation. We've been speaking to education organisations, we've been speaking to local businesses, local authorities. We're planning to organise some focus groups around services as well, so hoping to speak to sort of the NHS, fire, police, waste disposal, and looking at all of these different applications, discussing these different applications of e-cargo bikes. And then finally, we'll be sort of identifying the results of these findings and looking at some analysis, and hopefully beginning to develop a strategy to move forward. So we're hoping this scoping study will sort of lay the groundwork for a much bigger study at the end of the year or potentially next year, where we can start looking at trialling e-cargo bikes with these businesses and looking at sort of going beyond the theory and the discussions that we've had and looking at real world application, and then starting to see how they can be used on a day-to-day basis within these different sectors. So just to start with, for those who may not know much about cargo bikes, they're essentially very big bikes. They come in a range of different sizes, and they're designed to carry heavy loads, and so they usually have a big box on the front or maybe at the back, or maybe they could be attached to a big trailer which is able to carry a lot of goods. And recent models have been designed with an electric assist motor, which is enabling e-cargo bikes to go further than ever before and tackle terrain that was perhaps previously quite difficult, such as hills. As I mentioned, the bikes are quite heavy, and without that electric assist motor, it can be very difficult to navigate the hills. And this photograph is a great example. So this is one of some photos from an interviewee from the project who started up her own cargo bike delivery service in Calderdale in Yorkshire during COVID-19, and she is renting a cargo bike from a local bike shop, and she started doing local deliveries from local shops, which was enabling those businesses to stay open and to keep trading in a safe way during the height of lockdown. It was also able to supply food and goods to vulnerable people who were also unable to leave the houses during the height of lockdown. And so it's a particularly interesting case study, and also the relevance of this in terms of the electric assist that I just mentioned on the bikes is that Calderdale, for anyone who knows, is a particularly hilly part of the world. And so a lot of the trips that these bikes are making are often up and down quite regularly. But the electric assist on the cargo bike has allowed these trips to become possible and almost effortless in that way. So moving on to the findings, as I said, we're about halfway through the study, so findings aren't finalised yet, but I wanted to share some of the early observations that have been coming out of the interviews and the discussions so far. So one of the main things that's come out really is that cargo bikes are not as flexible as normal bikes when it comes to the road. By normal bikes, I mean sort of general push bikes. The size and the width of cargo bikes, which are often bigger and wider, means that they can't filter through traffic as easily. So as cyclists, I'm sure you are very familiar with the idea that you know how long it takes to get from your house to the train station, and it doesn't matter if it's raining or if it's rush hour or if it's sunny, you know that it takes 20 minutes because that's how long it takes. But with cargo bikes, unfortunately, that's not so much the case, because you're unable to filter through the traffic because of the width of the bikes. There's often not enough space on the roads to be able to just move freely, so you often get caught up in traffic, and it means that you're subject to traffic jams and red lights, and you often have to move at the speed of traffic, which in congested areas can often be quite problematic. And this feeds on to the second point of the findings, which is about challenges specific to different uses. So we spoke to a caterer who currently uses vans and does large-scale catering, and they're keen to look at the application of bikes, but they've said that depending on the size of the event will determine the feasibility of whether or not bikes can actually do it. So if they're providing catering for an event of 200-300 people, using bikes, they would either need a huge fleet of e-cargo bikes for the delivery, or they'd have to go back and forth throughout the day, and that would compromise potentially the quality of the food or the temperature at which the food is delivered to the clients. And it's not an insurmountable challenge, but I think it's a challenge that many caterers are still working out in terms of shifting towards sustainable transport modes. And having too many pickup points is also a limitation, particularly when it comes to shopping delivery services and food again. So if someone has to ride from 3 or 4 different shops to pick up food or pick up hot food and then deliver it to 3 or 4 destinations to maximise that delivery service, sort of being able to guarantee temperature of the food can be quite difficult when it comes to hot food deliveries. So yeah, that point about the cycling infrastructure not being suitable for cargo bikes, I think is one that came up quite a lot, particularly from the people I spoke to who were riding e-cargo bikes. And that seems to be quite a challenge because cargo bikes aren't really fit for off-road cycling infrastructure, particularly cycling infrastructure that's shared with people who are walking, because the bikes can go quite fast with the electric assist. They're big and heavy, and they take up a lot of space, and so that canal towpaths, for example, are perhaps not the most appropriate place for them. But at the same time, they're not able to filter through traffic as easily as a normal bicycle, so they often get caught up in road traffic, which can be problematic when you are relying on sort of tight delivery angles. Technology also came up as an essential application for businesses particularly. During COVID-19, so many businesses had to set up online shops and remote payment facilities, which was a new experience for them. Remote payment facilities allowed people at home to go onto the website, buy some goods, and then the cargo bike delivery people were then sort of told that delivery had come in remotely, and then they were able to pick up the goods and then deliver it to the person who just ordered them, which was previously unavailable when they didn't have online shops available. So technology is becoming quite an essential component in terms of bridging that gap between sort of the purchase of goods and then moving that through to the cargo bike delivery aspect. There's also, for people who are managing these delivery services, tracking apps are an essential part of it, and also route planning. So one of the interviews I had with the lady who was running that cargo bike scheme that I showed some pictures of previously in Calderdale, she has a tracking app on the bike so she can see where her riders are at all times. She's able to manage the route live, and so if orders come in from elsewhere and they're nearby a shop of which one of those orders has come in, they're able to reroute the rider to go to that shop, for example, to sort of maximise the efficiency of that service. Thinking a little bit more about barriers as well, the obvious cost is one of them. Cargo bikes are not cheap, they're in the thousands of pounds. And also perception is a barrier, because still in the UK, not many people really know what they are. People are familiar with bicycles because they've been around a long time, but when you say a cargo bike, not everyone really knows what that means or what it offers as a service. And so I think there's still a lot of education and awareness needed, which leads on to the next point, that if you don't know what something is, you tend not to be interested or want to use it. A lot of people don't want to put themselves in a situation where they might look vulnerable, trying something new and potentially looking silly. And so if people don't know what it is, they won't engage with it. And so I think there's a lot more opportunities needed to experience the bikes. We've been talking to a lot of organisations about how they'd be keen to trial bikes within the organisation so people can see what they look like and what they offer. And so I think one of the main findings that's come out is that more leasing schemes are required to give people the opportunity not only to experience what riding the bikes is like, but also seeing how these bikes can be practically used within the organisation on a day-to-day basis, rather than just thinking about it theoretically. I'd also just make a couple of comments on observations throughout COVID, because this project sort of started during the height of lockdown. So we've seen the pop-up bikes coming up in Manchester, which I mentioned earlier, influencing cycle behaviour and influencing an increase in cycling we've seen. From one of the focus groups, we spoke to the student union at Salford University, and they identified that the new students this year are starting to choose accommodation which is closer to campus, specifically to avoid having to rely on public transport to get onto campus because of COVID-19 fears, which is quite interesting. And students are, as a result of that, students are expressing an interest in sustainable modes of transport, being able to walk to campus or maybe being able to cycle to campus and around Manchester to avoid public transport because of concerns around COVID, which I think, to finalise, gives us an opportunity here, particularly looking around how cycling can be engaged as a result of COVID to encourage more physical activity, active travel and sustainable transport behaviours across Greater Manchester really. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of where we're up to. Hopefully we're aiming to finish the project around October, so in a couple of months, and then we'll be publishing a report, and if that's something you're interested in, please get in touch and I'll be happy to share it with you a bit later in the year. But thank you for listening for now, and I hope you enjoy the conference.